Hey everybody, Seth Campbell here with the new Segue Says podcast. Well, this episode is a very high energy one, and it's interesting in a number of ways, not least of which because we break one of my rules that I usually use, which is not doing two songs by the same artist back to back. However, we're combining those two songs with a third song by a different artist, and there's a very specific reason why I like to use these two songs by the same artist back to back in this segue, and I'll explain that as we go. Now, the songs are Driven to Tears, which is originally by The Police, and of course Sting's band, and it's more the Sting solo version that we're going to be using. And then there are two songs by, who else, this being the Segue Says podcast, Toto. The songs Carmen and Drag 'Em to the Roof. Lesser known for sure. Driven to Tears is probably the best known song. And I keep wanting to say Driven to Tears and enunciate each syllable. You'll hear why when we look at the song. So it's probably the best known of the three. This is one that I came up with. I didn't really think this out ahead. It just came out more just when I was just jamming on the keyboard. So we're going to look at each of these songs, and again, I'll explain why in this instance I think it's totally fine. And sometimes I think if you want to do a medley of an artist, you can of course always do back-to-back songs with them. I don't usually do it in this podcast is what I mean, but you'll see why in just a moment. Now, first up is Driven to Tears, which is on the Zenyatta Mondatta Police album. And it's the original version is actually much more kind of restrained and calm than Sting's solo version is. It's in A minor. Something like this. How can you say that you're not responsible? What does it have to do with me? What is my reaction? What should it be? Confronted by this latest atrocity. Driven to tears. Driven to tears. Driven to tears. Driven to tears. I mean, and the original version is good. Don't get me wrong. I like it a lot. I personally like Sting's live version better, particularly the way he's done it the past few years, which is much more driving, high-energy, power rock, intense. Because I think it matches the urgency of the song a bit better. It's a song, a lyrical song, a concept near and dear to my heart, which is totally freaking out about the state of the world and wondering what can possibly be done about it, because it doesn't seem like anything that we're doing at the moment is working. And it sounds a little more like this. Instead of A minor, E minor. How can you say that you're not responsible? What does it have to do with me? What is my reaction? What should it be? When confronted by this latest atrocity, driven to tears. Driven to tears. Driven to tears. The vocals, obviously, most artists, as they get older and their voice changes, they take songs down. Sting sent this one way up. And honestly, I like it better this way. The closest version on album to this one is the one on Bring on the Night, which was his solo debut live album. But in recent years when performing it, when I saw him touring with Paul Simon and then touring with Peter Gabriel and everything, it really stepped it up even further than that, honestly. So I'd look up a performance on YouTube from the last 4 or 5 years or so, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Dominic Miller's guitar in particular is just totally, unhinged. I love it. So that's Driven to Tears. That's the version of Driven to Tears we're going to be working with. Now, the two Toto songs, like I said, there's a reason I'm connecting these two. And that's because they both utilize very similar bass lines. The first one, Carmen, is from their fifth album, Isolation, which is kind of a forgotten album in a lot of levels. Didn't necessarily have any hits. Stranger in Town, I guess, was the closest. It was the first album without Bobby Kimball as lead singer. They had Fergie Frederiksen. It was the only album Fergie Frederiksen sang lead vocals on. And a lot of people panned it as like kind of sounding like a wannabe Journey album almost. And I mean, I can see it's not up there as my favorite Toto album, but I still really like it. It's very different, but I really like it. And this is the opening song on it, and the vocals are split between David Paich and Fergie Frederiksen, each singing as a different character. David Paich is kind of the narrator, and he sings the low parts, and then Fergie is singing that. This is not the same Fergie as in the Black Eyed Peas, incidentally, different Fergie. Fergie Frederiksen, who actually sadly passed away a couple years ago. Fergie sings the high part, and he's sort of the man in the story. It's a story of a woman who leaves a man suddenly without explanation, and he's confused because he has no idea, why she's gone or what he's supposed to do now. But it's centered around this groove. And then this is a verse chorus of it. Last night she went away, left a letter by the telephone, didn't take the time to say goodbye. He knows he has to find her, find a way to make her come back home. She stretched her wings and learned to fly. Carmen, don't you care for me? Carmen, don't you care? Carmen, don't you care for me? And so that's a snippet of how it goes. A lot of the songs on that album, and I don't know if you could really... I guess there's one ballad. There's a power ballad, How Does It Feel? But most of them have that kind of urgent rhythm to them. And so the next song, honestly, I wonder if the late, great Mike Porcaro, who is the bass player for both these albums that these songs are on, essentially had revisited the Carmen bass line, which is... and tried something new with it, because they ended up with this bass line that goes like this. And some 4 albums later, on an album called Tambu, they did a song called Drag 'Em to the Roof. And on the Tambu album, almost all the lead vocals are done with Steve Lukather. But there's a version of this song on the 2007 live album, Falling in Between Live. A lot of people don't really care for it because the production and editing of it was done not so well. They gave it to someone else because the band had essentially seemingly broke up at that point, and they gave it to someone else who essentially put like autocorrect on some of the vocals, and it just sounds kind of weird. But there are a couple of highlights, and this one is, to me, the highlight of the Falling in Between Live album and concert film. It's the big encore, and honestly, they take it so much further than the original album does, even though, admittedly, there were no Porcaros in the band at the time. David Paich wasn't on the tour with them. It's a long story, but original singer Bobby Kimball was back with them, and he took one of the parts that Steve Lukather sang in this song. And Bobby Kimball, of course, is the high voice, love isn't always on time. He did that, and he does it much better than I do. And so they, with his range, kind of expanded the chorus melody. And to me, it just kicks the song into a whole new gear. So, whatever you feel about the Falling in Between Live album, I haven't seen many people dispute that is one of the better moments on it. And so, again, it's a similar bass line to Carmen, but it starts much more low range instead of having all these high synth parts. Just like bass and guitar centric. They keep looking through the window. gaze across their eyes. Now that I've been betrayed, I must be well behaved. I'll drink corruption with their lies. Ooh, why was I hiding out? What am I running from? Why are they waiting? Have I always been the chosen one? Dragging to the roof, just push me over. Got no better place to be. Dragging to the roof, let's get it over. Perfect day to punish me. And so that's a verse, pre-chorus, chorus of Dragon to the Roof. Now the original one, and I like the original, and Steve Lukather, I love you. And the part he sings is pretty cool. It just, to me, it doesn't have the same sort of urgency and finality to it. I use the word urgency a lot in this podcast, because that's what these songs kind of are. This is a song of, the first one is the urgency of the state of the world. The second one is a frantic man who's just watched his life fall apart as his wife, it is a wife because there's a line, she wears the ring he gave her, and then this song is the urgency, like kind of like a person accepting, like kind of their comeuppance, if you will, the punishment, like whatever they've done, like, you know, it's all fallen apart, like last stand is over. But you know, the original chorus is cool. Drag into the room, just push me over. Got no better place to be. Drag into the room, just get it over. Or Bobby Kimball is doing this. Let's get it over. You know, to me, it's just that there's more range to it. I like it. It's very exciting to me. But anyway, those are our three songs, and there's a very specific reason that I want to include both Carmen and Drag Him to the Roof. Theoretically, this segue could be done with just one or the other, but I like to do this as Driven to Tears, Carmen, Drag Him to the Roof, Driven to Tears. And a big reason why is the different dynamics of Carmen and Drag Him to the Roof, and which part of the keyboard each one uses. And I already mentioned that a little bit. Carmen uses a lot of like higher notes and synth parts, whereas Dragon to the Roof is more gritty bass and guitars. And that kind of forms almost like a sonic narrative arc among these songs. Because Driven to Tears is pedal to the metal from the get-go, at least in this version that we're doing. So, and it ends like basically on a frantic jam. Driven to tears. And from there, because it's the same key and basically the same tempo, and both have a very prominent bass line, you can go into Carmen pretty smoothly. But especially because you've got, you know, these very filled-in chords and high notes, I like to jump to Carmen because, again, you've got chords and high notes going on the right hand. Instead of just going to Drag Him to the Roof, which is this much more broke down, you know. I mean, it works. It totally works. But it's like there's a much bigger jump to it. Whereas I feel like, you know, Driven to Tears, is very high. Carmen sort of brings it down a little bit, and since Carmen has such a similar bass line, it's easier to go from Carmen and Dragon to the Roof. It's very easy. So that doesn't feel like a jump, even though the dynamics are sort of dipping and ebbing and flowing. And then Dragon to the Roof builds up, builds up, builds up, and that gets you back into Driven to Tears, because Carmen ends similar with this. This kind of ending, but what I do is earlier it breaks down for a bass solo. And I just essentially replace that bass solo with the Dragon to the Roof bass line. And that gets you into Dragon to the Roof. And then at the end of Dragon to the Roof, particularly in the live version, there's also a jam that builds, basically out of this to this. It's basically, this big dramatic ending. And what I like to do there, once it's built up, driven to tears, driven to tears, driven to tears, and then do the last, the last chorus and out jam of Driven to Tears. So, to sort of to go through that whole thing one more time. You've got the end of Driven to Tears at the beginning. Driven to tears. She ran away, left a letter by the telephone, didn't take the time to say goodbye. And there you have Carmen. Now, end of Carmen. Let's Carmen, don't you care? Carmen, don't you care for me? Carmen, Carmen, don't you care for me? Carmen, Carmen, don't you care? Carmen, don't you care for me? Breakdown. They keep looking through the window. A cathode glaze across their eyes. That's Dragon to the Roof. And then you get to the very end of Dragon to the Roof, the last chorus. Dragon to the roof, no, 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 yeah. Let's get it over. It's a perfect day to punish me. essentially, from the post-chorus breakdown, this just builds. It's hard to do this. Jam out on that one. Now, like I said, you can easily do this. Just Driven to Tears, Carmen, Driven to Tears, or Driven to Tears, Dragging to the Roof, Driven to Tears. But I really, like I said, I didn't plan this one out ahead of time. It came out of a jam. And I was just screwing around on the piano. And to me, those are the segues. The ones that come out in jams are the ones that feel most natural to me, because it means, I can think of them on the spot instead of thinking, let's see, these two songs sound similar, how can I build a bridge between them? Those are the ones you sit down and think out, and those work. Those are great, they're fun. But the ones that you just kind of instinctively like, oh, I know where I'm going. To me, those are the ones that feel the most natural and are most musically connected. And so that's why I chose to keep this one as is and include 2 Toto songs for the price of 1, mixed with Driven to Tears, because like I said, it really kind of builds that dynamic arc to it that I personally really like. And and at this point, my family, when I came with this one when I was home with the family, and they've gotten used to my crazy piano jams occasionally at the last minute, quiet it down a little bit. So they've kind of learned to, and I don't blame them for this, to kind of tune me out a little bit and go about their lives. But I remember when I was first coming up with this one, as soon as I went back to Driven to Tears, my brother Spencer happened to be walking through the room, and he's like, oh, yeah. And so that's how I knew I had something there. Because, it broke through my family's desensitization to my keyboard segue madness. So that's my story with this one. But hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you've learned something. And hopefully, this will make you think a little bit about, when can you use 2 songs by the same artist back to back in a segue? Because you can do it. I mean, there's nothing explicitly wrong with it. I just generally haven't really done it here. But, it gives you something to think about when planning your next set list. So hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully you've learned something. And I will see you in the next episode. Take care of yourselves.